Hi everyone and welcome to Module 5. We're in the last module of this course, if you can believe it. This has really gone so quickly and it's been, for me at least, a lot of fun and a really interesting experience. I wanted to talk to you in this video about some of the major themes that we've been talking about in the context of a broader picture around issues of gender and educational leadership. And in thinking about this, I went back to a reading that I read a long time ago by an author who has been very influential in my own work, Jill Blackmore. She was actually the external examiner. She's from Melbourne, Australia. She was the external examiner for my doctoral defense. And since then, we've become friends. And I really not only appreciate her as a person, but I certainly appreciate her scholarship. As I said, her scholarship has been very influential in my own work on gender and leadership over the years. And I was introduced to her work in the early 90s when I read a chapter in John Spy's book called Critical Perspectives on Educational Leadership. It was published in 1989, so it's an old one now. But I can promise you that if you ever have a chance to read it, and it's available electronically from the library, it is well worth it. Theoretically, it still stands, and it stands strong in terms of thinking about and understanding notions of leadership. Some of it is, of course, a bit dated, but really, in terms of its core theoretical constructs, it's really an excellent book. Her chapter, called Educational Leadership, A Feminist Critique and Reconstruction, I can say honestly rocked my academic world. It's a tour de force of sociological and philosophical analysis that was just so much more than I had been able to find until then. Once I started reading it, I literally couldn't put it down. But that was partly because to understand it takes several readings of the complex texts. It isn't an easy read, but it's well worth the work. I used to, and I sometimes still do, assign it as one of the readings in the course, but you have to have time to read it, digest it, talk about it, think about it some more, go back to it, and that sort of thing. And in a course like this, that goes by so quickly, we really don't have the time to do that. But I would recommend it. So if you have, your finished courses this summer and you're sitting on your deck and you're thinking, what could I read? Well, I would recommend this entirely because it really is well worth the effort. Anyway, and if you do, let me know because I'd really be interested to know that that's something that you actually approached and learned from. One of the claims that she makes in this very interesting article is that historically, various theories of administration, organizations, and leadership are masculinist. Now, this isn't news now. We've read readings since then that have talked about this very thing. But she was one of the first to really put this out there and provide a really strong theoretical case for it. That is, she argues that these theories of educational administration, leadership, organizations, and so on have been shaped by the experience and practices of men. Not surprisingly, since men were predominantly those who exercised leadership in the public sphere for generations, even centuries for that matter. The result of this was that women in contemporary theories of educational leadership were either invisible, they simply weren't there, or they were considered deficient, primarily because they weren't men, or they didn't act like men. They didn't approach the tasks that were in front of them like men. Further, even when they were included, they were interpreted through male categories of experience. So to put this analysis in another context, let's consider medical theories of heart disease. Now, this may seem like a bit of a stretch, but stay with me. This is something I have a lot of experience with, unfortunately, both in my own life, my father's life, my mother's life, my daughter's life. It's one of those generational things. But in my example, when I was working out in a cardio recreational program that was provided after my first open heart surgery, I met a woman who was doing the same. And we got talking, and in the course of our conversation, she asked me what I did, and I responded, and I mentioned that I was interested in gender and leadership. Wow, that perked her up immediately. And she said, well, I can tell you that women are invisible to cardiologists, which is interesting in terms of what we've just said. She said that I'd been to a doctor several times with symptoms that were unusual for me, And the doctor sloughed it off as menopause, as anxiety, as acid reflux, and so on. But the symptoms didn't go away. And then my husband was diagnosed with heart issues. So she was the one, she said, who carried the suitcases when they traveled, who made sure that the foods were going to support his health and so on, until one day she collapsed and they found out that her heart issues should have been taken, first of all, care of long ago, and secondly, that they were way worse than her husband's. So what does this have to do with this course? Well, there's been a lot of research, as Blackmore argues, over the years that have revealed that all of the research that's been done, Blackmore doesn't argue this, but I've learned since then that there's been a lot of research that's been done for years premised on men's heart issues, how heart attacks presented medically as really the way men experience heart attacks, but were presented as non-gendered. That is, everybody experiences heart attacks because men experience them that way. So these research findings, one could argue, were masculinist. That is, they were premised on men's experiences, but it turns out that women present very differently for all kinds of physiological reasons, but many cardiologists still make diagnoses based on masculinist norms. For example, my daughter recently had a heart attack. In fact, she had 2 heart attacks. She was not sent up to the cath lab until after she'd had her second heart attack, and that's because her first heart attack had already in some ways resolved itself while she was in eMERGE, but she wasn't tested until later because her presentation was not what doctors would expect of a heart attack based on masculinist norms. So this explains why women are more likely to die of a heart attack, for example. They're sent to the cath lab much later than men quite often. So that key and central time for intervention is past sometimes for women by the time they actually get there. So based on the theories that existed, women's symptoms remained invisible. And when they persisted and complained about their condition, they were labeled as, troublesome patients, medically deficient, and so on. Fortunately, of course, this is changing as understanding grows and knowledge is shared. And while there are still some areas that need improvement, there's a lot of work that has been done. So that sort of suggests, as we found out in this course, that gender is a social construct, and so the kinds of implications of that can be changed as our understandings around the social context change as well. So to return to gender and educational leadership then, and theories of educational leadership, women were invisible or judged as deficient, as Blackmore argues. But she goes on to argue that dominant socioeconomic and political discourses that have shaped our world in significant ways, such as patriarchy and capitalism, have socially constructed women as objects in non-egalitarian states. That is, women were constructed by the laws that existed, by the practices that existed, as non-entities, as invisible, as deficient. So women, particularly women who are minority women due to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, indigeneity, and/or disability, have been acted on by the political and social arrangements of the state. I remember years ago being in York in the UK for a conference and was invited over to one of the attendees' homes for dinner. She showed me the deed to her home, and it was really interesting. It was beautiful. Parts of it were, done with medieval kind of script. This, dated back to the 1700s. And we traced the ownership, and as we were going through, both of us interested in gender issues, we noticed that it stayed within an ancestral lineage for generations, but the family name would change. And that was because property couldn't be passed on to the female of the house, only to the male of the house. So if there was no male heir, it would be passed down to the spouse of a female child. This went on well into the 20th century. In fact, when I bought my house in Edmonton, I was teaching in Victoria at the time. Actually, I got a kind of emergency call from my lawyer who was making the arrangements to say that I had to prove no spousal encumbrances, or I had to have permission of a male spouse to buy my property. Now, this was in 2003, and I don't know whether this is still the case in Alberta or not, but it certainly was then. So issues around what females and males can do were considered quite differently. Voting rights, child custody, rights to a woman's body, etc., were, and in some cases still are, within the control of the state. In education, however, and to differing degrees in society more broadly, the current understanding is that there is a need for a more equitable, ethical expectation around access, treatment, and results for all in our educational systems. This means that those who have had less access to what we might call social benefits should be treated fairly which means that we treat equals equally and we treat unequals unequally. Now, I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, so let me explain it this way. One of my children is diabetic, one of my children is not. If I had treated them both equally, exactly equally, one of them would have been very unhealthy or even worse. That is, if I'd given insulin to neither of them, or if I'd given insulin to both of them, it would have had very, very serious repercussions, obviously. In social contexts, of course, it's much more complex in terms of the ways we think through these issues. But if children come to our schools with needs that interfere with their ability to learn, then we need to, as a system, this isn't a burden that individuals should have to take on, but our systems should reflect this concern, that we need to consider what we may need to provide in order for them to reach their potential. And that means treating equals equally, treating unequals unequally. So, remedial help and all those sorts of things. This applies to all aspects of the school environment, including access to teaching positions as well as higher status positions. There have been equity laws that have come and gone in some of the provinces in Canada, not all of them, around increasing participation of men and women in positions where they are underrepresented, as well as those who are visible minorities, Indigenous people, and the differently abled. Those policies disappeared with political party changes in government, but some teacher organizations have status of women committees, diversity committees, and so on. These kinds of committees have more or less power, and they certainly don't have the kind of power that they might have if they were, integrated into a policy building organization or something like that. But they can advocate and work strategically to improve opportunities and conditions for all of these groups that have been historically underserved, where they have been neglected and oppressed, even in many cases. Realistically, though, despite the existence of these committees, and actually Alberta is very shortly to have its own status of women committee, I've heard sort of by the grapevine. So that's good news, because it means that it's an extra voice out there. But realistically, it often falls to teachers because systems kind of fail us. And these systems need to be knowledgeable individuals who work individually, or preferably, because it has more power, with groups to work strategically to enhance leadership opportunities for women and minorities, to improve the discourse around men in teaching so that more men consider teaching in what are now non-traditional subject areas, and grades, to speak out when gender-based bullying occurs, to work across staff contexts to support LGBTQI+ students, and the list could go on, and we've talked about many of these things in the course, and you will be in your artifact assignments as well. When we do this work, we need to be aware, of course, that gender work is slow. I mean, we're working against norms that have been in place for a very, very, very long time. They're deeply embedded in us in ways that are invisible to us most of the time. I sometimes say to a class, suppose you woke up as a man and the rest of the time have identified as a woman, or vice versa. How would your life change? And after, kind of puzzlement for a while and thinking about it and some jokes and all of that sort of thing, it really is interesting what starts to emerge. So when we think about it that way, what difference does it make? And when we really think that through in terms of opportunities that exist for men and women in educational organizations, for boys and girls in organizations, and when we think about that even more in more complex ways across a spectrum of gendered identities, then it's worth our time to become informed, to act as an advocate for change, to, in the words of Margaret Mead, be the change we want to be, and to see more broadly in our schools, and for our students and for our communities and in our own families for that matter. So over this last module, in Module 5, we're going to learn from our colleagues through their video presentations and the forum in which the videos are discussed. We're also going to learn from a broad range of literature that considers the effects of gender on many of the issues you have suggested related to the organization of work and school practices. And so it's a fairly broad list. I wasn't able to get at everything, and I'm sorry about that. As you know, when you start doing a literature search, not everything is exactly the way you want it to be. And so I've tried to get as close to it as I can, or I've found something in that area that might be of interest. I don't even agree with some of the readings, but they're interesting nevertheless to think about critically based on what we've talked about in our course. So I invite you to do that. So we're going to consider all of that. And we're also going to choose a topic of interest around gender issues in schooling and in school practices, school policies, and so on, that may be related to your artifact presentation if that's the way you choose to go, or another issue altogether. I'll leave that up to you. So it's going to be a busy module, of course, as these last couple of modules have been, but we have almost 2 weeks, just shy of 2 weeks for everything. And I have room, a little bit of wiggle room if you need a little bit of wiggle room. So that will help. But I do need to get my marks in. It's just the nature of the requirements that I have within a certain time limit. So if you need more than that, a significant amount of time more than that, let me know, because I'll need to make those kinds of arrangements. But it's always important to let me know as soon as you can rather than later, so that we can make those kinds of arrangements. So as always, if you have any questions about any of this during Module 5 or even after Module 5, please let me know. I also want you to know that it has been a great pleasure to teach this class, to get to meet each one of you, at least electronically, to begin exploring a growing literature on gender and educational leadership. And I hope, as I said, that this has whetted your appetite for more engagement with this topic. And for those of you who are continuing your academic journey, I wish you the very, very best. And if you have any further questions as you move through the program and you think, I wonder what this has, what kind of implications this has for gender issues, and you would like to talk about that, then just let me know. I'm always interested in having those kinds of conversations. And for those who are completing your program, well, all the best to you and congratulations, because this will be your last course. So you'll be able to take this and take it back into your workplace and put it into practice immediately, and that's great. So it's been a pleasure to learn from each one of you in the course. I wish you the very, very best. I am looking forward to this module and the various contributions you make on the forums. And as I said, and as usual, if you have any questions, just let me know. All the best.